Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyekolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, perhaps more than any other international Africa-focused organisation, the UK-based Royal African Society has evoked the current realities of life in Africa, the sights, sounds, issues and debates in this vast, vibrant continent. From current affairs to the arts, the RAS has for more than a century explored the cultural vitality and economic complexity of Africa, setting the context for some of the important issues facing its people and their relationship with the rest of the world. This year, as the Royal African Society marks 120 years since it was founded in 1901, we speak to its current director, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, about its history and its latest advocacy on behalf of Africa as Britain's presidency of the G7 gets underway. And later, 30 years ago this week, the first shots were fired in Sierra Leone as former Army Corporal Foday Sankoh and his United Revolutionary Front began a campaign to overthrow President Joseph Saïdou Momo. It set off one of the most brutal and barbaric conflicts in post-independence Africa, a civil war that lasted 10 years. So what's the background to that terrible conflict, and what has Sierra Leone learned? We'll speak to the international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett, who was there in Sierra Leone and in neighboring Liberia, and who covered the war extensively. Coming up. Now, if there's one international organization that has for decades tried to engage audiences and governments with a broader representation of Africa, providing new perspectives and a deeper understanding of the continent, it would have to be the Royal African Society. Swinging from north to south and from east to west and everything in between, the RAS has ranged through life across Africa: money, sociopolitics, economy, the arts, music, and a huge wealth and variety of literature, as African artists grapple in their writing with the nature of identity in a world of shifting boundaries and conflicting countries. Through it all, for over 100 years, the Royal African Society has shared African perspectives, their thinking, their expectations, the movers and shakers, as well as the most urgent issues facing the continent today.
Quite sure what the Royal African Society is? Well, listen up, because although we've been around for simply ages, we are still going places. We are the hottest hub for everything that's innovative, creative, coming out of the continent. We also connect people, academics, business people, politicians. We administer the all-party parliamentary group on Africa, which is the largest group of its kind in the British Parliament. African Arguments, our magazine, is a site where you hear hard-hitting opinions, controversial views, some of the best journalism coming out of the continent and also from the diaspora here in the UK. Our education programme brings vibrant cultural programmes to our schools.
When I was very kindly asked the patron of the Royal African Society last year, it was a pretty easy offer to accept. As events such as your Africa Rights and Film Africa festivals demonstrate, African communities continue to make an essential contribution to the future of both this country and the African continent.
Our diverse and influential network has a great deal to offer, so please come and find out more what the Royal African Society can do for you and also what you can do for us.
Well, you couldn't get a better plug there than a member of the royal family talking about the Royal African Society. Well, this year, the RAS is marking its 120-year anniversary. It was founded in 1901, and to assess what it's done in that time and where it is heading today, I'm delighted to say that the director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, joins me now from London. Dr. Westcott, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And the Royal African Society is marking, as I mentioned, its 120th anniversary this year. It was founded in 1901. Tell us about that and also about the influence the Society has had on a post-colonial generation.
Charles, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for showing Zainab Badawi, our chair, and Prince William, our royal patron. The Society has been through many changes over those 120 years. It was founded in memory of a remarkable woman called Mary Kingsley, who was unusual in that she did not support colonial government. She did not support the mission enterprise. She traveled in Africa and she wanted to listen to the African voice, listen to Africans and understand them. But after she passed away, the Society was, shall I say, captured by the colonial enterprise. And for about 50 years, from the First World War till just after the Second World War, it was the forum for debate amongst the colonial elite as to how to govern Africa. But this changed after the Second World War because African voices started being raised and being given a platform by the Society through its journals, through its events. And the early African nationalists were amongst those who came and spoke to the Royal African Society. And after independence, it became a fulcrum of debate about how independent Africa was going to develop and how the rest of the world should relate to it. And that continued for some time, where the Royal African Society was the forum that people came to discuss these things. And it has changed again over the last 20 years because it has opened out towards the influence of the African diaspora in Britain. And a lot of our events that we now do are largely attended by people from the African diaspora in the UK. And part of our role is to raise their voice as well as Africa's voice in Britain, in the world, to ensure that it can be heard. This voice also is very much something that we project in Africa. And Zainab Badawi mentioned their African Arguments website. And this is really a forum in which African journalists, African analysts, African experts can express views that sometimes they can't express at home, but we can provide a home for them to discuss those things. So we do now 4 broad things. We connect people. We provide a network for all those interested in Africa from Africa in the UK and beyond. Secondly, we educate. We try and improve the understanding of Africa in this country. And just this year, we're launching a project to try and reform the British curriculum so that Africa is more effectively covered and better understood in schools here. Thirdly, we debate through things like African Arguments, through our meetings here, economic questions, political questions, human rights questions, issues of democracy, issues of commercial interest, and how things are evolving. But above all, I would say we celebrate African culture, African arts, African literature through our festivals, Film Africa and Africa Rights. So there's been a journey here over the last 120 years. There will be a continued journey over the next 120 years. But what we're doing is now engaging with the here and now and looking forward to both how Africa is going to change and how Britain is going to change.
Well, that's a very interesting journey that you just set out for us. And of course, in the course of your description there, you rather answered my next question, which was the fact that the Royal African Society was seen more recently involved in the fight for freedom in places like South Africa, and often expressing empathy with those in the front line of the battle for more African recognition. And I was going to ask you whether that was always the case, even in the days of the colonialists of old, but you rather answered that question. So let me ask you this, because I saw Prince William in that video we just played. I understand the Queen stepped down as patron of the Royal African Society and around 24 other organizations as well. She stopped being their patron in 2016. Presumably an acknowledgement of advancing age.
Yeah, in 2017, she decided it was time to bring in the younger generation. And Prince William, as he said himself, has a very real, very vibrant interest in Africa. He's traveled there many times. He knows many people there, and he was delighted to take it up. And he has been very active as a patron in promoting what the society does and listening to what we have to say.
And how much does the Royal African Society give insight into some of the great concerns currently facing Africa from an African perspective, such as the dangers of rising extremism, the entrenchment of autocratic rule in some countries, that sort of thing?
We have a whole series of platform debates and discussions about this. African Arguments is constantly looking at the issues. It had a great series a couple of years ago at the time of the African Cup of Nations on what role football plays in African society, because we all know it's absolutely central. But similarly, the question of gay rights has been very contested across Africa. We examine that kind of issue. And we are constantly looking at the question of government, democracy. Is directed development the right way to go? How do different countries adapt to that? We had a session last week on Ethiopia, where there's a very difficult situation there now. How does this match with the reform program that Prime Minister Abiy had declared? And we debated that, the question of the rule of law there. Next, in 2 weeks' time, we have a book launch about Rwanda, and particularly the RPF government there by Michaela Wrong, which you should all come listen to. Very current, topical, quite difficult issues. We'll be publishing an article soon on what's the situation of Tanzania following the untimely death of President Magufuli. All those, it's social, it's cultural. We have one event on the 1st of April I should draw your attention to, particularly of interest to the listeners in Nigeria. We are launching a book called Loot, about fate of the Benin bronzes. And again, these are very contested issues, which are quite sensitive in this country as in Africa. And our aim is to give people a platform on which to debate them freely, openly, so that the public can be better informed about all the issues involved.
Okay, well, that's the first half of the chat. We'll come back in a minute to talk about the second half, which is your advocacy with the British government on behalf of Africa. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, marking 120 years since the RAS was founded in 1901. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Inyegolu. Now, my first guest today, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, is the director of the UK-based Royal African Society, which is marking 120 years since it was founded in 1901. And one of the things that the RAS does well is advocacy on behalf of Africa. This year, as Britain's presidency of the G7 gets underway, the British Prime Minister will welcome G7 leaders to a summit in Cornwall. He's announced he'll also invite the leaders of India, South Korea and Australia for a meeting of major democracies to be called the D10. And the Royal African Society has been making the case for inviting Nigeria and South Africa to join the assembled Democrats, arguing that this is the way for the ballot to replace the bullet. Never mind the fact that there is more talk of democratic backsliding on the continent, with elections in Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Uganda and the Republic of Congo deemed to be imperfect and damaging, and of course Ethiopia, where elections became another bone of contention between Tigray and the central government, precipitating a civil conflict there. And with me via WebEx from London, the director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. So just make the case and the arguments to us that you made to Downing Street, Dr. Westcott, for the inclusion of Nigeria and South Africa in the D10 major democracies.
Thank you. Yes, I think Africa gets a bad press when it comes to politics. It is seen as a home of dictators and perverted democracies where it's all manipulated and corruption. Whereas in fact, there has been a much more steady progress towards genuine, what I would call pluralism, where government becomes increasingly accountable it has certainly become increasingly peaceful. A number of civil wars in Africa, while there are some still going, as you say, in Ethiopia, frozen ones in South Sudan, rebellions in Mozambique, but the number overall has reduced. And that is largely due to the progress that has been made in representative government. Increasingly, there are countries like Nigeria, like South Africa, that have a strong and growing democratic tradition where people will go to the wire sometimes. No democracy is perfect, no election is perfect, but increasingly people are willing to settle their disputes in court through argument rather than through bullet and in the streets. Nigeria itself has had, since 2000, it's had 5 elections, 2 changes of government in the course of that, 3 different leaders. No leader has outstayed the 2-term limit, and maybe a little persuasion and pressure was needed to ensure that they stepped down at the end, but they have successfully done so. And that illustrates the importance of allowing the people to be engaged in a political process, because when they are, it is actually easier to resolve these difficult issues. Every democracy is a constant process of argument and debate. There are almost none that are perpetually tranquil and peaceful. That's because the difficult issues are raised in public. They're not suppressed, they're not pushed down. And in both South Africa and Nigeria, they are good examples where things are not perfect, but they are being peacefully sorted. And that requires pressure from the public. And Nigeria itself experienced the NSAS movement last year, which was quite a turning point, because the young people are becoming engaged in politics. They're demanding that their voice is heard. The young people are the great hope, the great challenge for Africa, because there simply aren't enough jobs. But getting involved in the political process should help there be policies adopted that will support growth and create those kind of jobs for the young people to fulfill. You can empower young people other ways. The quickest way of empowering young people is to give them a Kalashnikov. This is not constructive. It tends to lead to bad outcomes. You see that outcome actually in northeast Nigeria itself. The Boko Haram insurgency is people who had no better way of trying to make a living, find something to do than revolt. And governments have to provide that opportunity. So both Nigeria and South Africa have demonstrated they have governments that are willing to look at this, not always as willing as the people would like, but they are democratic governments. And in that role, they should be admitted to the councils of democracies. It's important to demonstrate that those countries in Africa that have a democratic tradition, have democratic practices, can stand shoulder to shoulder with all the countries of the world with a democratic tradition in defending that.
Right, okay. Well, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you. You've certainly convinced me with your arguments there, but what's been the response from the British government? I understand they met you halfway.
We have a 50% result so far. Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa, has just been invited yesterday, I think, to join the G7 summit. So we're getting there. Okay, we have one more to go.
Okay, well, keep trying, keep pushing. And is that at the heart of the sort of advocacy on behalf of Africa that the RAS does, making a case for the continent at the highest levels of power and global discourse?
We do it through our public platforms. We also run the Africa All-Party Parliamentary Group in the British Parliament, and that enables us to engage with MPs and to multiply the impact of our advocacy in that respect. But it's persuading people through rational argument and through access. And that is what tends to change people's opinion. You have to persist. If at first you don't succeed, ask why, and then try again.
And was that a difficult argument to make, given all the talk about democratic backsliding on the continent?
challenging because there is a glib press media perception here that Africa is still a basket case. We managed to push back against that narrative in the 2000s, but there are events like that in Ethiopia, like the situation in Tanzania at the last election, which challenge that. But the successes tend to go underreported and unregarded, like the tradition in Nigeria, like the recent elections in Ghana, which were on quite a knife edge, but it went to the courts. The courts have taken a decision. The parliament is divided. It'll be difficult for President Akufo-Addo, but it's peaceful. Likewise, even in somewhere like Guinea or Cote d'Ivoire, strong criticism, but at the moment, the political situation remains peaceful. And we need to draw attention to this. There are arguments over term limits, sure, but each country is justified in taking its own decision on whether it wants term limits or not. So it's bringing to attention the good cases, as well as the fact that the media will usually focus. Bad news sells, let's face it.
Well, I mean, I suppose the argument goes both ways, doesn't it? I mean, do you take African governments to task when they abuse their power and violate the rights of their people? In 1 minute.
Yes, indeed. But it is for the African citizens themselves to be free to do that. It's not for the outside world to prescribe what Africans should do, but the people of their own country, Uganda, for example, should be free to say, Museveni, your time's up. We want to change.
Okay, I want to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, for taking the time to talk to us today as the Royal African Society, of which you are the director, marks 120 years since it was founded. And Dr. Westcott was talking to me there from London. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead, including 30 years ago this week, the first shots were fired in Sierra Leone, setting off one of the most brutal conflicts in post-independence Africa. We'll assess what's happened since then. Stay with us.